Welcome to Channel 24. Today's my guest is well-known historian, writer, and a senior fellow from the Hoover Institution from Stanford University, Niall Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and that you thank you so much for dedicating time to me.
That's a great pleasure to be back in Kyiv.
So, let's just straight to the point. Today at the Yalta Yes conference organized by Viktor Pinchuk, people talking not about only how to end the war, but also that the risk of Russia going further than Ukraine is higher than ever. And my question is about Poland. Poland is once again facing the Moscow's snarling phase. Is Europe ready to defend together and to act united, not like it was in the World War II, with Poland, I mean?
Well, it had better be. After all, Poland is a member of NATO, unlike Ukraine, and therefore, if Poland were to be attacked, or for that matter, if any NATO member state were to be attacked by Russia, then Article 5 says that NATO has to respond. I think we've seen Russia pushing the limits of NATO tolerance for some time, actually. It's not the first violation of NATO airspace that Russia has been guilty of, and Russia has also been up to mischief in the waters, the territorial waters of NATO members. So this incursion into Polish airspace of Russian drones is not the first thing that the Russians have done that signals Putin's intention to test NATO and see if there really would be a collective response in the event of a Russian attack.
So if you were sitting in Moscow, what response you have seen?
If I were sitting in Moscow and I were advising President Putin, I'd be very happy because I would sense a kind of weakness within NATO. And I already kind of suspected it because I saw the way that President Trump treated the NATO leadership and the other European NATO members at the summit in The Hague. Although the United States is still in NATO, it's very striking that the United States has essentially stopped sending aid, financial or military aid, to Ukraine. And President Trump has essentially said to the European members of NATO, this is your problem. Oh, and by the way, you need to increase your defense budgets because they were far too low before. Now, from Russia's vantage point, any kind of tension across the Atlantic is good because your hope is that when you finally do take the chance and take military action against a NATO member, the United States will say, this is not our problem, it's your problem. And at that point, NATO has ceased to function as a military alliance.
I don't know whether you have heard, but in 2022, Ukrainians were kind of ironically saying about the United Nations that they are the United Nations of nothing. And don't you think that NATO also in a risks to become such an organization?
I think it's a huge risk that NATO loses credibility, because without credibility, no treaty is worth the paper that it's written on. Of course, the United Nations has been in some state of disrepair for years, but the nadir was the Security Council meeting on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, when a Russian was sitting in the chair. My son, who was then 10, asked if we were watching Saturday Night Live, a comedy show. I said, no, this is the real UN Security Council you're seeing. Now, NATO risks becoming a laughingstock if it does not respond credibly to the threat of Russian aggression against NATO members. And I'm disappointed in the response that we've seen since Polish airspace was violated. I think it's a mistake on the part of President Trump to dismiss this as some kind of error. You don't commit an error for hours on end, and the Russian drones were in Polish airspace for many hours. I think it's also concerning that they weren't all shot down. That calls into question NATO's air defences. So for all kinds of reasons, this is a bad moment for NATO, and it's extremely important that we see a much more firm diplomatic response. I'm not saying we need NATO strikes on Russia, but we need to make it clear in unequivocal language that this is unacceptable and it risks an escalation of the situation beyond where we currently are, an escalation that would involve NATO military action against Russia. Russia has to realize that that is possible. Right now, Putin acts as if he thinks it can never happen.
Yeah, but I'm afraid, Mr. Ferguson, that Russia will only understand when NATO will actually strike inside the Russia.
I don't think that's quite true. I do think it's important that the discussion...
To show the willingness.
Well, let me just finish.
Yeah.
It's important that the discussion about security guarantees for Ukraine after the end of the war now involves an open discussion of European troops being present in Ukraine. That's an important step towards, I think, a very much needed transformation of Ukraine's relationship with Europe. I think it's unlikely that Ukraine is going to become a member of NATO, because I do not think that is something that the United States is willing to do. I do think it's plausible that Ukraine can become a member of the European Union, but that will be meaningless if the European Union does not have meaningful strategic autonomy. Right now it doesn't. If the United States says, this is your problem, Ukraine is your problem, that leaves a huge gap in the military capabilities that Europe can make available to Ukraine. Europe has money. It has plenty of money. It's spent vastly more on COVID relief than it has spent on aid to Ukraine so far. But the money that it allocates to defense is far less than it should be. And the speed with which increased spending is translating into hardware, into weaponry that is useful to Ukraine is also far too slow. So I think the critical issue is not, do we strike targets in Russia? Leave that to Ukraine. Ukraine is getting very good at that. What Russia will be impressed by is a rapid European rearmament that leads to meaningful resources being made available to Ukraine. There are two words that any Russian leader lives in fear of, and those two words are German rearmament. It's happening now, but it's not happening fast enough, and I don't think it's happening on a sufficient scale meaningfully to change Putin's calculus. But that's still possible. The coming months are going to be very important. I've argued here at the YES conference that we need an Operation Warp Speed for German rearmament. And that means faster mobilization of resources and a much more coherent response to the nature of the war that we face. I worry that European generals want to rearm for the war of the 1990s. That's to say, they're going to invest in hardware that is obsolete. The war of the future is overwhelmingly a drone war in which autonomous systems, AI, satellite communications will be crucial. And the Europeans have a long way to go to be competitive with the United States in those domains. So what will impress Putin is not gestures. Right now, what will impress Putin is a meaningful increase in the pace of German and more generally European rearmament, combined with aid to Ukraine that makes a difference on the battlefield. Support, for example, for Ukrainian air defenses, which without American support are looking vulnerable.
So, going to the next question. That's quite a long one, so I'm going to take a look at my notes. At one time, it was precisely the British intelligence services that picked up KGB officer Vasily Mirokhin. And he showed, perhaps better than anyone, how the Soviet secret service was operated, yes, and the very organization out of which today's FSB was born. So it seems that the principles of Russian intelligence work have not changed, actually. And yet they are still very successful. And my questions to you, why Europeans, knowing that, still not taking the advantage and opportunity to fight against it properly?
The Soviet archives are full of interesting insights into the nature of the Soviet system. Not only the Mitrokhin papers, but papers that were accessible to Western scholars after the fall of the Soviet Union reveal how this strange totalitarian regime functioned. It was good at certain things. It was good at competing, for example, in building nuclear weapons, and it kept pace and then overtook the United States in its construction of nuclear weapons. And the Soviet system was also quite good at penetrating Western intelligence services and sowing disinformation in Western media. So Putin's Russian Federation has inherited some of that institutional capacity. For example, it has scaled up its weapons production in ways that took the West by surprise. Very few people thought there would be such a rapid build-up of Russian military production after the war broke out. People in the West thought sanctions would make that difficult. They were completely wrong, and we now see that Russia is building more drones in its factories than Ukraine can in its. They're not such good drones, but mass matters in a conflict like this. The other thing that Putin's Russia can do that the Soviets also were good at is disinformation. In fact, this Russia is better at disinformation than the Soviets were, because this Russia has the internet to play with. It has vast Western platforms, which we call social media, to play with. So in some ways, Putin's Russia owes a lot to the Soviet Union. It's very obvious in the way that Putin himself thinks. But it's a mistake to think that Putin's trying to rebuild or resurrect the Soviet Union. He's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. And in his fantasy world, he's Peter the Great. So it's a different project that he has as compared with Lenin and Stalin. But I think you're right to say that there are elements of the Soviet system still alive in Putin's Russia. They coexist with an imperial fantasy, and of course they coexist with a kleptocratic, corrupt criminal state that owes as much to the Sicilian mafia as to anything Russian.
Recently I was reading the war correspondent who was covering a lot of wars for the recent decades, and he said that after the war the mood in the country is very disappointing. So kind of a disappointing moment is coming. Of course, depending from how the war has ended. So my question to you about Georgia, actually. So Georgia lost its war to Russia in 2008, and now we see the pro-Russian government and absolutely different mood in Georgia, among Georgian people. From your perspective, Mr. Ferguson, don't you see that Ukraine have this threat to be in a position to be in that disappointing mood after the war will end? So we will accept somehow pro-Russian government, or I don't know, with the threat of a next war is coming, we will agree on such things.
I think the prospect of defeat is much worse for Ukraine than for Georgia, because this war has of course been much more costly. I think it's a war designed to obliterate Ukraine. I also think that if one looks at the way the Russian government has treated Ukrainians in their zones of occupation, it's a terrible warning of what a Russian victory would be like. So I think it's a different situation from the one that Georgia's in. I think it's important to contemplate the nightmare scenario of defeat, because that will motivate not only Ukrainians to keep fighting, but more importantly, I think we need to get Europeans to imagine the fall of Kyiv. We need to get Europeans to imagine what happens if Ukraine is broken, because at that point, then the whole of European NATO is threatened directly by Russia, because Putin won't stop. He won't be content. His goal is not to acquire Ukrainian territory. His goal is to break Ukraine as an independent democratic state and then to challenge NATO and break it. And he only does that when he shows that he can attack a NATO member without there being a full-scale war. So from the European point of view, the defeat of Ukraine is as big a nightmare, or nearly as big a nightmare, as it is for the Ukrainian people. I don't like to think what it would be like to live in this city if Russia succeeded in reimposing its authority. I think it would be a far worse situation than anything that we've seen in Tbilisi.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson, for dedicating time to me. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.